Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always, I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends from radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners, and especially when we see comments underneath the episodes on different podcast platforms. It's really nice to see. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story. And if you would consider supporting the show, there's a link in the show notes. And once again, thank you so much to everyone who has contributed to the Patreon. It means a huge amount to us. Now, in this episode of the show, we're going to be discussing the Fenians. And this is a really important issue because it really leads into a lot of the revolutionary history we were dealing with in early 20th century Ireland.
It certainly does. I mean, you can make a case that the ideology of Irish republicanism goes back to the 1790s, and in some ways it does. But I think modern Irish republicanism is really the product of the Fenians and that movement in the late 19th century. And a lot of the kind of contradictions of Irish republicanism are also summed up, I think, in the Fenian movement, which is hopefully something that we can talk about. But the Fenians themselves, Cathal, as we're going to talk about, were themselves the product of a just prior period of Irish nationalism, the repeal movement and the Young Ireland movement.
Well, absolutely. We haven't dealt a huge amount with this period in Irish history, like early 19th century. But we have dealt before, as listeners will know, with 1798, as you mentioned there. And one of the things about 1798 is it's incredibly bloody. The counter-revolution by the British state involves tens of thousands of people being killed. There's huge battles across Ireland. And in a way, the Irish people are almost cowed from considering physical force, separatism. But as we get into this period, we have to talk about probably the most significant character in 19th century Irish history, who is Daniel O'Connell.
Yeah, but just to finish what you're saying there, Cathal, about 1798, I think people miss this nowadays when they talk about 1798 a little bit, because the immediate aftermath of it is, like you say, total fear. Because the repression is very severe. And it's not just the British, it's also like the Ascendancy Party, as they call themselves, or the Ultra Protestants, or the newly formed Orange Order, the Yeomanry, etc. It's very much seen as a victory for like reaction in Ireland. And like you said, the folk memory for about 50 years afterwards is just of total fear. Well, let's not do that again, because look what happened the last time. The thing is, as well, is 1798 is largely remembered for the big battles that happened in County Wexford and in the West when the French landed, etc. But there's also a kind of a low-level insurgency throughout the country. A lot of it is agrarian crime and the secret society, the defenders and stuff like that. So actually, there's political violence right away across the country. And the same is true of the reaction of the house burning and the half-hanging and the transportations to Australia and so on. So as you said, physical force really out of fashion, for the next 50 years in Ireland.
Well, that's the thing. If physical force is out of fashion, the main alternative then is mass movement, democratic, non-violent pressure from the Irish people. And before we move into the repeal movement, I suppose the blueprint for the repeal movement is the Catholic emancipation movement.
Yeah, exactly. So O'Connell who, as most people will aware, leads a kind of a mass movement which he sets up with the aid of sympathisers. And some people have called it the first proto-political party in Ireland, the Catholic Association, where people paid the equivalent of a membership fee, the Catholic rent, so-called. And O'Connell famously uses non-violent tactics. So O'Connell gets himself elected for County Clare in 1829, the idea being to show how unfair it is that a Catholic can be elected but can't sit in Parliament because of his religion. So he manages to force emancipation, which is removing the last of the penal laws in 1829. So we talked about this at length in our last podcast, Cathal, on the penal laws. But his next project, obviously, was the repeal of the Union, which is reversing the Act of Union of 1800, but not going back to the 1790s either, in the sense that what he wants is an Irish Parliament, restoration of the independent Kingdom of Ireland with equal rights for all religions. And he also, in fairness to O'Connell, in theory, wants one man, one vote. Like, he falls out with the Chartists in England who were seeking one man, one vote in England, but that's more of a personality thing with him, between him and a fascinating character who we should talk about in the future called Fergus O'Connor, another Irishman. But O'Connell's campaign for repeal of the Union really gathers steam in the late 1830s and particularly the early 1840s, especially after he's elected as Lord Mayor for Dublin. So he's the first Catholic elected as Lord Mayor of Dublin since the days of James II. And it's a similar approach, of course, to the emancipation movement in that the tactics are non-violence, and he's using mass meetings, and particularly famously the mass meeting at Clontarf in 1843.
That was one of the big surprises when I was much younger, like teenager, reading memoirs from Irish Republicans who would always condemn O'Connell. And my first thought was like, oh, I thought O'Connell was the great leader of Irish nationalism. And it's mainly this point where they really begin well, they look back and really despise him, that he calls off the monster meeting in Clontarf after
Yeah.
the British have said that it has to be banned.
Yeah, and so the sequence of events is actually the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Robert Peel, banned the meeting. He called it an attempt to break up the British Empire, which of course exposes people to the charge of treason, for which there's a death penalty. But O'Connell, being the pacifist, calls off the meeting. And so it's one of the things where he breaks with the more radical nationalists in the Young Ireland movement, which we're just about to get onto. Although, for example, Robert Key, in his famous books, The Green Flag, and his TV series, made the point that they didn't actually break over Clontarf. They agreed with the decision in the short term that it must prevent bloodshed. You know, you're looking at a very nasty situation if you have a crowd of 1 million people who are converging on Dublin, and, you know, a warship had sailed into Dublin Bay and several regiments of the British Army and so on. Being fired on would have been a terrible massacre. So actually, the Young Irelanders agreed with O'Connell in the short term. But one of the interesting things about O'Connell, I think, from our perspective, looking back, is that O'Connell is sort of like a hate figure, a despised figure nowadays among Irish Republicans. You know,
Yeah.
he's not only for calling off Clontarf, but O'Connell had no interest in the Irish language. O'Connell did things like, you know, he acquiesced in the real cutting of the franchise in Ireland. Like, he wanted one man, one vote in theory, but actually he acquiesced in the franchise being cut to something like, I think it's a tenth of the men or something like that in Ireland.
Yeah.
And things like that. So O'Connell's not really a political or social radical, like as Republicans would want him to be.
Well, that's the thing. He is a compromiser. He's a pragmatist. And a lot of the Republican leaders, especially of the mid to late 19th century, are not compromisers and not pragmatists.
I mean, the heart of Irish republicanism is non-compromise. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the whole point of it in a way. I mean, someone talked about the Fenians as being not so much an ideology as an attitude, you know, defiance to British rule, and it's a way of asserting people's place in society, you know, by being a Fenian. So, I mean, O'Connell, the compromiser, the facilitator, the man who calls for 3 cheers for Queen Victoria and so on,
Yeah.
he's just not what you're looking for. You know, he's a different kind of hero. So O'Connell is a kind of a folk hero for like mid Catholic society. Like, I recently read the memoirs of Humphrey O'Sullivan, who was a school teacher in County Kilkenny in the 1830s, and he's a big fan of O'Connell. But the repealers, of whom O'Sullivan is one, are like, you know, they're the backbone of Catholic middle class Ireland, and they raise what they call the rabble when they need them. They don't particularly
Mm.
like them all that much. So we can probably see parallels with later Irish nationalism there. Interestingly, though, one thing I find very interesting is originally the split between O'Connell and the political radicals in Young Ireland around the Nation newspaper is partly sectarian in that the Young Irelanders are mostly Protestant. So one of the first open splits between the two is over the question of universities, Cathal, which I'm sure you've come across as well.
Yes, it seems like such such a strange debate now to us in the early 21st century, but about third level education in Ireland and the expansion of third level education and the sectarianisation of third level education. And it's something that continues on over the decades, like Gladstone has to deal with it. They're dealing with it in early 20th century Ireland, the British government, about religious control of universities. Now, pre 1793 and under the penal laws, as we dealt with in our penal laws episodes, Catholics couldn't be admitted as undergraduates to Trinity. And with the slow repeal of the penal laws, one of the laws that are repealed is that Catholics can attend Trinity College. But like when we get into the 19th century, obviously you want to expand university education throughout the whole country. But it's like we should have separate universities for each religious denomination. So Trinity College can remain for the Church of Ireland, Queen's University in Belfast, that can be for the Presbyterians, and the different Queen's colleges in Galway and Cork, they can be for the Catholic Church. So the idea that all religions can attend university, that all religions would be catered for in terms of chaplaincy or whatever, this wasn't the idea. It was we separate people in primary school, we separate people in secondary school based on their religion. They should also be separated again in university. Seems
Yeah.
utterly bizarre.
Well, I mean, I must be honest, I don't think it's that bizarre at all, for that society. So, like, I mean, the O'Connellites are about raising up the Catholic people, including raising up the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church wants its own universities, and O'Connell says, well, why can't we have our own church? What's so special about you Protestants that you get to get one? So he has this famous debate with Thomas Davis, who's a young Irelander. Now, the young Irelanders, to be clear, are arguing for secular education based on Enlightenment values, etc. But O'Connell insists, no, the Catholics have to have universities. And not only that, but we should have most of them because we hear the majority of the people. And you can see how this would play into his base. But, there's a famous debate, and Davis says to O'Connell, my Catholic friend, my very Catholic friend. And O'Connell interrupts him. He says, excuse me, he says, I hope there's nothing wrong with being a Catholic. And Davis apparently breaks down in tears, and then they actually make up and they embrace and stuff in a very theatrical 19th century style. But it's interesting that that's one of the first things where there's an open break between O'Connell, the Catholic politician, and the Young Irelanders, who have taken on the mantle of not quite Irish republicanism yet, but radical Irish nationalism.
Well, that's the thing. We should really move on to Young Ireland. And I suppose we could really make the argument that all the subsequent Republican groups grow out of the Young Ireland movement. Not exclusively, but they could be viewed as a progenitor of future Irish republicanism.
Yeah, and basically, the way I see this is what the Young Irelanders do is they rehabilitate the memory of 1798. And so some of the ideas in independent Irish Republic, the use of force if necessary, although they come to that quite late in the day, the idea of Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter, although O'Connell himself used that rhetoric as well, because O'Connell
Mm,
used all kinds of rhetoric, throughout his career.
yeah.
And there was lots of Protestants in O'Connell's organizations, the Catholic Association and the Repeal Association. But in any case, the Young Irelanders are rehabilitating the mantle of 1798, because as we discussed, for the previous 50 years, it had been taboo to speak of it, as the song goes, who fears to speak of 98, because it was such a terrible memory, because of the terrible violence. So the Young Irelanders saying, no, it wasn't such a bad thing, it was a noble failure kind of thing. And in the late 1840s, also, like they break with O'Connell in 1846 over the question of physical force. So O'Connell famously is the pacifist. Now, it turns out that O'Connell himself didn't quite say Irish freedom is not worth a single drop of blood. One of the Young Irelanders said that about O'Connell. So it's a bit, it's a bit
Yeah.
like the famous quote O'Connell attributed to the Duke of Wellington. But that's what they split in 1846, because Young Ireland aren't yet advocating rebellion, but they're saying it's permissible. Whereas O'Connell says, no, we must never use violence. We must only use moral force.
Well, as you mentioned there, in the late 1840s, just quite a bit of Irish blood has been spilled, not in battle,
Mm.
but through disease and famine and emigration.
Yeah, so it's a catastrophic decade, as most listeners will be aware. But for those not aware, you have the chronology depends a little bit, but between 1845 and 1848, 49, about 1 million people die of famine and disease in Ireland, caused in one part by the failure of the potato crop, but also by the absolutely catastrophic mismanagement, and that's a kind term, by the British government. So, for example, British government cuts off all the aid to Ireland in 1847, insists all the aid has to be paid for in Ireland itself. They provide military escort to food leaving the country. They provide police and military for landlords evicting tenants. So John Mitchell, who was the most vocal young Irelander on this, famously says that this is an attempt to wipe out the Irish people. And he says it's a carefully crafted plan to wipe out the Irish people silently, where you don't have to use weapons. You can just let famine and disease do the job. So some of the young Irelanders come at that point to the conclusion that they must have rebellion because the circumstances are so dire.
Well, it's another point as well that they make that because O'Connell has such a connection with the Whigs, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the Liberals or the Whigs who are in power when the famine begins, that he's too wedded to his allies in the Whigs, and he's not willing to attack them in the way that they should be attacked, considering the scale of the problem in Ireland, and also his huge antipathy to the Conservative leader, Sir Robert Peel. Whereas, ironically, it's the Conservatives who do a far better job in dealing with the famine in Ireland than the Liberals do.
Yeah, but of course, the Young Ireland argument is like, and this is the subsequent Irish Republican argument, of course, is you shouldn't be tied to any English political party. The whole point is
Yeah.
Ireland should defend its own interests. Just one thing on this, though, before we get on to the rebellion of 1848, such as it was, is the Young Irelanders themselves are not from the peasant class who people who die in the famine. A lot of them are Protestants, not all of them are, but most of them are. They're minor landowners like William Smith O'Brien and so on. They're lawyers and journalists and stuff like that. So they're one or two of them from the lower gentry class, but mostly kind of from the urban middle class.
Well, yes, that's interesting as well because, as we should say, it sort of grew out of the debating societies of Trinity College Dublin, people like Thomas Davis and John Mitchell, as you mentioned there. And there's a couple of things that I think are very interesting about the nation. One is we see the role of journalism and having a prominent newspaper. And there's so many subsequent revolutionaries and republicans in Ireland are journalists and writers. The other thing as well is that when you look at O'Connell's very, utilitarian view of repeal, they are much more focused as well on the cultural nationalist aspect. Whereas O'Connell is a fluent Gaeilgeoir, he's from County Kerry, a very Irish speaking part of the country at that time. He's no great affection for the Irish language. Whereas somebody like Thomas Davis, Protestant, he really focuses on the importance of the Irish language, the importance of pride in our culture and our history and our literature and all these different things. That these are the things that really make a nation.
Exactly. So it's and this is of course consistent with Europe at the time. It's romantic nationalism, the idea that the real culture lies in the folk, the people, and so on. So even though the Young Irelanders, and again, this is similar to nationalists elsewhere in Europe, are not part of that class. That's not the point. They say this is the real folk culture, and it must be not only revived, but it's the basis of the nation.
Also, like when we mention young Ireland in this period, there's young Germany, young England, young Italy.
Yeah.
It's part of a wider European movement. Well, not so much, I suppose movement is the wrong word because while some people try to imply that there's a young Europe and there's some connection between them all, it is a young Ireland movement. But throughout Europe, these currents are occurring all throughout the continent of younger, upper middle class, very romantic revolutionaries who want to see a big change in Europe.
Yeah, and typically in the revolutions of 1848, so what they want is to overthrow these reactionary monarchies they've had since the end of the Napoleonic War. They want a written constitution. They want a representative assembly. They want self-determination for the nations. It's not a conspiracy, but it is a common tendency. And also the tricolour flags. So there's a host of tricolour flags that emerge in 1848, modeled on the French one, but including the Irish tricolour, which also comes from 1848. So we can see
Yes.
it is part of a European-wide tendency, if not a movement, Cathal.
Yes. We should move on now to what's referred to as the Rebellion of 1848. Now, this
Yeah,
is
and it's one of
after
the, yeah,
it's after Black 47. It's after the absolute worst period during the famine. And people probably are not surprised that there is a rebellion in Ireland. People listening now is like, I can't believe there wasn't a rebellion. But the rebellion of 1848, even though it's listed as part of a catalogue along with Tone and Emmet and
Mm.
1916, it doesn't really fit in along with these others, does it?
Well, it's a bit of a shambles, but like, I mean, it's interesting what you say, though. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Cork in recent years, and on the National Monument on Grand Parade in Cork, they have all the rebellions listed out, and they have 1798, 1803, 1848, 1867, and some of these events didn't amount to all that much, as we know. But 1848 has got a bad press over the years, and it's called lots of derisory names like the Battle of Widow McCormack's, Cabbage Patch, etc. But one of the interesting things I think is, first of all, the Young Irelanders, they split from O'Connell and they formed their own organisation, which is called the Irish Confederation, and it's a serious movement. Like, so this is obscured by the absolute fiasco of their rebellion. But they have, according to some accounts, up to 50,000 members. And as you said, in famine Ireland, this is very significant, because a lot of people have died and are fleeing the country, and people are suffering from malnutrition and disease and so on. It's taken very seriously by the British government, so they introduced a coercion act to deal with it, and they introduced the crime of treason felony, which is a slightly lesser form of treason, meaning that you don't automatically get executed. You can be transported to Australia instead, which is again what happens to most of the Young Irelanders. But they preemptively, if that's the right word, preemptively rather, arrest the leaders beforehand. So John Mitchell was arrested in February of 1848, and several of the others, William Smith O'Brien, I think, is arrested also before any rising is contemplated. And then they suppressed their newspaper, of course, The Nation, which, as you mentioned, is their great organ. And then this is also something that we're going to see in 1867. It's kind of a similar pattern. So the state gets in first, but like the remaining leaders mobilize a load of followers in County Tipperary. But it's not actually clear what they're going to do. Like, they haven't said they're going to enter into rebellion. They get into kind of a skirmish then with the constabulary, not yet called the Royal Irish Constabulary, just the Irish Constabulary at the time. And what happens actually is that they surround some of the constabulary in this Widow McCormack's farm in Ballingeary in County Tipperary. And there's a bit of a shootout, but that's it basically. That wasn't planned. And then they disperse, and mostly people get arrested. A lot of them get transported to Australia, and most of them thereafter, like Thomas Francis Meagher and John Mitchell and others, make their way then to Australia. And one or two of them, like William Smith O'Brien, eventually make their way back to Ireland. But it fizzles out basically because they haven't decided what to do. They've been hamstrung by all these arrests, and they were never really committed to a rebellion. They don't have a clear social program. Like James Connolly, in his book Labour in Irish History, wrote very scathingly of the Young Irelanders, saying, in this terrible, catastrophic period of the famine, they couldn't even announce that they were going to expropriate the land of the landowners. This is possibly because some of them were indeed
Yes.
landowners themselves. So it's a kind of a confused, anticlimactic end. I mean, it's barely a rebellion at all, really.
And it leads us on to the character who's going to become the most prominent Republican over the next couple of decades in building this new movement, James Stephens, who manages to make his way to Europe. And after the rebellion, he took part in the battle there in Ballingeary, but he ends up in France. And like in many other generations, Paris is a university of rebellion and revolution, particularly in that post 1848 world.
Yeah, and now just for context on Paris, what has happened in Paris is in February of 1848, there's a revolution which overthrows the monarchy, what's called the July monarchy in France, but the second monarchy really after the French Revolution was overthrown, or Napoleon was overthrown. And then in June of 1848, there's another attempted revolution in Paris, which is more for workers' rights and things like that. But the point is that Paris is again the capital of the French Republic. The tricolour is back as the flag. The Marseillaise is back as the national anthem, and so Paris is again seen as the place where European republicanism is based out of.
One of the interesting things when you're reading about James Stephens is that he's interacting with all these different European revolutionaries who are exiled in Paris and talking to French revolutionaries. And he's trying to build up a blueprint of how a successful revolutionary movement could be built in Ireland, one that could possibly successfully drive the British out of Ireland and set up a republic. And I suppose when he comes back to Ireland and he's going throughout Ireland, one of the things that really becomes apparent to him is that the land issue is one issue that you can really see the revolutionary spirit of the ordinary Irish people.
Yeah, I mean, and this is probably the biggest distinction between the Fenians who do grow out of Young Ireland, But the biggest distinction between the Fenians and the Young Irelanders is that the Fenians very much tap into the tradition of secret societies, the
Mm.
agrarian discontent, the social problems, especially of rural Ireland. Although the Fenians are also an urban phenomenon as well, as we'll come back to. But as you said, the Fenians really tap into the deep well of discontent on the land in the post-famine period.
Yes, and I suppose the other thing that really makes the movement is the connection with America. And now you always had large Irish immigration to North America, but after the famine period, you have an awful lot of Irish people in America who are completely hostile and bitter towards Britain,
And have reasonable grounds
with
for that,
reasonable
I would
grounds.
say. Yeah, and so like in terms of the sequence of events, so James Stephens and John O'Mahony meet in Paris, and they decide we're going to have another go basically at revolution in Ireland, but we're going to be better organized next time, and we're going to be organized in circles they call it, which is in later IRB history. This is a very small group, but actually they envisage it as like a battalion, like around 800 people, and then there's going to be a center who they report to, and then there's going to be a hierarchical organization that's going to be led by a supreme council. And this is true throughout Irish Republican Brotherhood or Fenian history. But John O'Mahony, I believe, is sent to America to organize the American branch, which is initially known as the Fenian Brotherhood, whereas James Stephens, to my understanding anyway, founds the Irish branch in Dublin, which is going to be known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood or the IRB.
Yes, found on Lombard Street. I didn't know it.
Lombard Street, okay.
Yeah, I didn't know
Yeah,
that it was actually found on
I didn't
Lombard
know that.
Street
Yeah.
till I was doing research for this episode. So for people in Dublin, it's near Pearse Station. It's just off Pearse Street and near Westland Row.
If I may be permitted a slight digression, Cathal, like, I'm always like you doing some reading beforehand. And I mean, I'm always struck by these Dublin streets, which are now very nondescript. Like, there's not much on Lombard Street today.
Yeah,
And they have such actually rich history. Some of these little alleyways or streets which have just been, they've been redeveloped for housing and so on. They're very
yeah.
nondescript, but they have such incredible rich history, some of them.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So that's the thing, as you've just mentioned there about the American movement. So one of the things that happens from decade after decade after decade, well into the late 20th century, is probably still existing to this day, although to a far smaller extent, is America being an engine for Irish republicanism. That it's somewhere where you can do fundraising, where you can do propaganda, where you can supply weapons. So having this American arm to the organization is so important. And with an event that's going to come up in America, it's going to be even more important, the American Civil War.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to bracket the American stuff for a sec because I just want to talk about Dublin. Been living a little bit in Cork recently, but I mean, I'm back in God's own country in Dublin now. So no, but one of the things that I find fascinating is like Fenianism, as we'll talk about, is to a degree a rural phenomenon, but it's also a thing in Dublin as well. Both the British authorities actually and the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, as we'll get onto, no doubt, hates the Fenians for being godless republicans and also being a secret society. But both of them are alarmed by an event in 1861, which is the funeral of an American Fenian called Terence McManus. Now, his body he just dies of natural causes, but his body, a bit like O'Donovan Rossa in later years, but Terence McManus's body is taken back to Dublin, and there's an enormous funeral, and the funeral happens at night time. Body lies in state in Abbey Street in central Dublin, near the offices, I think, of the Irish People of the Fenian newspaper, and 8,000 people, come past to see the body. And the authorities are really worried by this, and they say, what kind of people are involved? And this is very interesting because this is true of Irish republicanism in Dublin all the way through the 20th century as well, up until more recent times. They find they are skills tradesmen, workers with some education, not the elite of society at all, but also not the poorest class. They're skilled workers, the educated workers, and particularly at that time from the west of the city. So in Dublin, we talk about the north side, south side divide, but actually at that time, the Liberties and that kind of area was the more traditional working class part of the city. This is something I find really fascinating. So Fenianism in Dublin shows its face first in this funeral in 1861.
When you look at that funeral, and obviously the first thing that occurs to you is that it's a forerunner of O'Donovan Rossa and his funeral, and how that's such a big stepping stone on the way to 1916. But when you look at the newspaper coverage of Terence McManus's funeral, he died in San Francisco and been sent back to Ireland. is that it lists, as is the case in these 19th century reports on funerals, it lists all the people who've attended and all the groups. And there's so many trade union
That's right. Yeah.
members. It's like the Society of Bakers, the Society of Tailors, so on and so on, who are all
The guild,
represented at
the
this.
ancient guild of stonemasons, my favorite.
Yes, but like they're officially represented, and how important these bodies were to the skilled working class of Dublin. And they want to be involved in this, to be
Yeah,
associated with it.
absolutely. And it fits into later things, but it's interesting to see it so early. So it shows it's a really long-standing pattern. But in rural Ireland, I mean, James Stephens and John Devoy, who was a young man from County Kildare at the time, people like that travel throughout the country. And they seem to find a receptive audience in the early 1860s for their message because they begin recruiting circles throughout the country. Now, I strongly suspect, and I think other research shows that, they tap in very strongly to pre-existing secret societies. And, you've had secret societies in Ireland going back to the 18th century, the White Boys, the Defenders, the Right Boys, the Rockites, and so on and so on. And it's not that great a jump, and there's actually been Republican rhetoric noticed in secret societies in the early 19th century as well, following from 1798. But you start to see them using the green flag with the harp, which is the Fenians flag. You start to see them using phrases like "I swear allegiance to the Irish Republic," which is the IRB's oath. And so there's certainly a penetration of probably the rural secret societies in the early 1860s. And this isn't surprising, really, because in the post famine period, people are very insecure. They're still at threat of eviction, they're at threat of rising rents. The population decline caused by the famine and by subsequent emigration is putting them in slightly a stronger position, but they're still in a very vulnerable position and obviously very worried about another famine.
Something you can see as the 19th century grows on, this fear that the estates will be completely cleared for cattle grazing instead of tillage, which will mean that people will be off the land and cows will be on the land.
Precisely. And this is something the Fenians explicitly say in their proclamation in 1867. So the land is for the people, not for the cattle, they say.
Hmm. So, one of the things we should say as well is that when you're talking there about circles, like one of the ideas behind it was that if you had a circle, a group of like 10 people, only the leader of that circle would know who the next higher up group would be. There'd only be one
Yeah.
connection to sort of cut down on informers. And initially, it's quite successful at, limiting the constant bane of Irish republicanism, the informer.
Yeah, not just Irish republicanism, but also the secret societies as well. So
Yes.
Brendan McSweeny, for example, from Donegal, has written a great book about winding up a ribbon society in Donegal in, I think, the 1850s. And, the way the police, they recruit one reformer and then they threaten him and then they branch it out and then they roll up the whole. And it's the classic thing.
Yeah. 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 Um, so we will move on to America now. And obviously,
Yes.
we have the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. And arguably the largest single ethnic group, immigrant group in America who are involved in the Civil War are the Irish.
Well, the Irish and the Germans, I think, are about equal. But
Yes,
yeah,
that immigration, Irish immigration into America in the famine and in the post-famine period, it's mainly to the north, the northern cities, the big northern cities in America, places like New York and Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. So, unsurprisingly, most of the Irish involvement is on the Union side, the northern side in the Civil War. But we also
yeah.
have substantial Irish communities in places like New Orleans and also that
Hmm.
older, mainly Irish Protestant immigration in the 18th century and early 19th century. That's going into the southern states. So they're very heavily involved in the Confederate Army.
Yeah. I mean, like in terms of the rank and file Irish involvement, and there's people know more about this than us, like Damien Shields is the big expert on this, but you know, most of the Irish recruited are not there for ideological reasons. They're not there because they oppose slavery or they endorse slavery. They're there because they're either conscripted in some cases, but they're also there for the pay and they're there for a job in the new country and so on. But in terms of the Irish political exiles, most of them fortunately, I suppose, end up on the Union side, but some of them don't. So Thomas Francis Meagher, who was a young Irelander and who was the originator of the Irish tricolour, raises a regiment in New York for the Union. But John Mitchell, very sadly, lends his pen to the Confederate side, and he talks about how slavery is not such a bad thing at all, etc. But generally speaking, the Irish political exiles in America do take the Union side.
Yes, and it's unfortunate, especially in the last couple of years, as we're talking about getting rid of statues or renaming buildings or renaming organizations. There was a lot of John Mitchell's GA clubs around the country, things like that. That,
Yeah, there's one in Newry, for example, and there's probably lots
yeah,
more around it.
while endorsing everything he says in Ireland and his revolutionary writings, he has this enormous black spot on his character regarding slavery because he becomes a big supporter of the Confederacy.
He does. He does. Now, we can't relitigate that, but that is the case. So John Mitchell supported the Confederacy, and there are also one or two other former Young Irelanders, I think, on the Confederate side, and they were recruited or they raised units, because of their profile. But generally, the vast majority of Irish who fight in that war, and there are hundreds of thousands, I think, of them, they do fight on the Union side. But from the point of view of Fenianism and our conversation, the important point is that a very large number of Irish men have military training. They've been through the American Civil War. And now we shouldn't make out that most of them were Fenians, but the Fenians do recruit a substantial number of them, which is the important thing.
Yes, James Stevens, I think, did tend to exaggerate. When he was in America, he was exaggerating about Ireland. When he was in Ireland, he was exaggerating about America. But one of the things he did say was that we've managed to recruit 100,000 American Civil War veterans into the Fenians. And while those numbers are not accurate at all, they did manage to recruit quite a few.
They did, and as we'll talk about, they actually managed to launch military operations from the United States into Canada just after the Civil War in 1866 and then 1871. So, it takes quite a lot of organization to do that. You need quite a few people. Now, they've nothing like 100,000, but they have military units, they have weapons, they have some organization to do this, and they send lots of people back to Ireland in 1867. So it's not a fantasy. They do have lots of veterans of the Civil War, mostly Union veterans. I suppose there might have been one or two Confederates as well, but mostly Union veterans. And this fits in much better with their ideology, of course, which is about the rights of man and the equality of people and stuff. But yeah, I mean, the Fenian raids are the first military action taken by the Fenian Brotherhood, and one of the most weird, I always thought.
Well, it's one of the most far-reaching as well. Like it has a huge effect. It may seem like small skirmishes across the border from the US into Canada, but it has quite serious repercussions in a way. Like it does speed up the process of the Confederation of Canada and
Yeah,
from becoming British North America and these sort of not really connected provinces across what is today Canada. But it has a big effect on relationships between Britain and America because, like, this is British imperial sovereign territory. And suddenly
yeah.
you have men crossing the border, launching an invasion, but most of them are still dressed in their Union outfits.
That's correct, which is the uniform of the American Army. So there's only one
Yes.
America because the Union wins the Civil War. And so, the international context here is kind of interesting, and we'll return to the Fenian stuff in just a sec. But during the Civil War, the British toyed with supporting the Confederacy at various points. Now, when it became clearly a war for the emancipation of slaves and the end of slavery, then the British really couldn't do it because, it was against their own stated values, let's say that. But when it was a war for states' rights or perceived as that in the first 2 years of the Civil War, the British did toy about that and they did talk about mediating between the two of them and recognizing the Confederacy. Now, the Union were not too pleased with the British as a result. And so there was a certain amount of toleration for the Fenians and their raids into Canada. So we're talking about, for people who are not aware, military units of Fenians. We're talking about a couple of thousand, though, 2 to 3,000, something like that, making their way from the United States into Canada with the intention of holding parts of Canada and disrupting their transport system and forcing the British to make concessions in Ireland or even to leave Ireland. Now, a very ambitious plan and probably never going to happen. They fought a skirmish with the Canadian militia, the place called Ridgeway, which they got the better of, but then faced with superior forces, they had to leave. But the point is that the Americans actually tolerated it at that time. So bad were their relations with Britain.
Well, yes, because that's the difference between the Irish Republican movement, like two sides of the same movement. But in Ireland, it's a treasonous organization. You could be sent to jail just for being a member. In America, you can have an office. You can openly recruit. You can hold meetings. You can say you're a member. It's a perfectly legal organization.
Yeah. And so that doesn't work out, obviously, the rate of 1866, but it really grasps everyone's attention. And as we've mentioned, in Ireland itself, it's becoming apparent that this is a serious problem for the established order in Ireland, both in terms of British rule, but also like the agrarian order, the landlord holding of land and so on. So the next plan really is combining the two sides of the movement. So the Fenian Brotherhood, as it's known in America, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood, as it's known in Ireland. And they're going to bring back veterans of the Civil War to Ireland to lead an armed rebellion in 1867.
Yes, because this is, I suppose, one of the issues that's really affecting Stevens's leadership is that he's been saying for a long time now that like we are going to have a rebellion, we're going to have a rebellion. 1865 is going to be the year of rebellion. That's the year we're going to have the revolution. And that doesn't quite happen. So it has to be 1866. And that doesn't quite happen. So the leadership now is starting to look ineffectual and impotent in the face of thousands of armed men in America who are ready to fight, military veterans, thousands of members in Ireland who are ready to fight, and all this money that's been raised. So it's almost as if they're pushed into, they have no choice. They must have a rebellion soon.
Yeah, not the first people or the last in Irish history to be kind of caught by their own rhetoric into action before they're ready to do it. But the other thing as well is, of course, the Fenians in Ireland, although they're, as you say, a banned organization, they do have a newspaper. So just like the Young Irelanders, they have, but instead of the nation, they have the Irish people. And, you know, literacy is increasing in Ireland because you have national education at primary level since the 1830s. You have also people, and this is a common phenomenon in Europe at the time, is newspapers being read to other people. So people who were literate are reading to people who can't read. And so it has a very wide effect on Irish society, the Irish people. And one of the first things the British do is they ban the newspaper.
Yes, and that's something we can see in the early 20th century as well. In 1916, Arthur Griffith's newspapers during the War of Independence. Being able to be in control of the narrative is very, very important.
Yeah. Now James Stephens, it's eerily similar to 1848 in some ways. James Stephens is arrested well before any rebellion can happen. Now James Stephens, as it happens, was imprisoned in Richmond Bridewell, which is now Griffith College in Dublin on the South Circular Road, which I happened to do a history on once upon a time. And what happens is actually, this is also interesting because the Fenians have a great penetration of people who are serving in the armed forces and in the various state organizations. So he's imprisoned in Richmond Bridewell, where he's awaiting trial for treason felony, which is the crime. And one of the warders smuggles in a key, and Stevens just lets himself out of his cell. And then someone else on the inside arranges a ladder up against the wall, and someone else on the outside arranges another ladder. So there's a lot of collusion going on in Stephen's escape, which is also interesting. But the next thing is Stevens escapes from Richmond Bridewell and is smuggled off to America, where very embarrassingly for the British he appears openly. But again, a little bit like 1848, this kind of decapitates the movement. John Devoy, the other big figurehead, who spends most of the rest of his life in America, is likewise arrested. Habeas corpus is suspended. So the Lord Lieutenant at the time, a guy called Lord Mayo, brings in the Coercion Act, the suspension of habeas corpus. Now, for those who don't know the Latin term, habeas corpus is the right not to be arrested without trial. So in our language, it's internment, is introduced in 1866. But what's interesting when you start to look at it, because you're thinking now, you're looking at the IRB or the Fenians as a nationalist movement and a political movement, and they are that, and they are planning for political rebellion. But you really see a massive upsurge in what the authorities call agrarian crime as well. And this really tells you about the character of Fenianism on the ground in rural areas. So they are doing things like they're drilling on hilltops, they're doing military style drill, but they're also doing things like they're hawking the cattle of an unpopular landlord. They're shooting at agents who are raising the rent. They're attacking people who have grabbed land, who have taken land where people were evicted, and so on like this. And so the Coercion Act is also directed against them. It's not just directed at like the political side, but the character of Fenianism very strongly, agrarian as well as political. They're two sides of the same coin.
There's something you mentioned there, John, about the penetration of the British forces. And obviously, with James Stephen Steers, the prison service, Her Majesty's prisons at the time. But you would assume, like, yes, obviously there's going to be some penetration of Irish regiments in the British Army, but there was a lot of regiments, British Army regiments in Britain that were heavily infiltrated. Things like the King's Own Liverpool Regiment,
Yeah,
really heavily Irish regiments in like the northeast of England near Newcastle, places like Manchester, Birmingham, London, where the leadership of the British Army is very worried about the reliability of these regiments if there was a rebellion in Ireland. And you can see in some circumstances where these soldiers are kept on base and the weapons and the magazine rooms are locked up so that they can't be accessed.
that's right. Now, I'm glad you mentioned England, actually, because we've spoken about Ireland and we've spoken about America, but there's also massive emigration, of course, to England and to Scotland from Ireland in this period, and particularly to the north of England, not only, but particularly to the north of England to work in the industries there. So, one very famous Fenian is Michael Davitt, who is born in England, actually, and loses his hand in a factory accident in Lancashire. But in Lancashire itself, there was actually a raid by Fenians, an assault on a military depot in Chester, trying to seize the weapons, which shows you A, the number of Irish there, but B, the penetration of the Fenians. And as we'll get onto in Manchester, one of the famous incidents of the rebellion occurs as well. So, like, there's a massive Fenian problem, if you like, in England itself at the time.
I suppose as we're getting now into 1867 and the year of rebellion with the Fenians, perhaps you could tell us about like the political ideology, and that's really laid out very clearly in their proclamation.
Exactly. So I have actually the proclamation in front of me, Cahill, here. So just, I can read bits and pieces from it. It's a mixture of Irish nationalism, republicanism, and the idea of fair settlement on the land, basically. So it starts off, we have suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, and bitter misery. Our rights and liberties have been trampled by an alien aristocracy who, treating us as foes, usurped our lands and drew away from our unfortunate country all material riches. Now, there's a lot going on there. So it's the idea that the country's been conquered. It's an alien aristocracy. Now, of course, this is, you know, going back to the 1600s and the seizure of all Catholic owned land and even
Mm.
the 1500s as well. And it says the real owners of the soil were removed to make room for cattle and driven across the ocean to seek the means of living. So this is not so much nationalism as social here. So the real owners of the soil are the people who till the soil, and they're being removed to make way for cattle. It says we appealed in vain to reason and sense of justice. Our mildest remonstrances were met with sneers and contempt. Our appeals to arms were always unsuccessful. But today, having no honourable alternative left, we again appeal to force as our last resource. Now, in other words, they say we've tried everything else and now we're going to use force. Now every revolutionary organization always says that. They move on here to the Republican side, the political ideology. All men are born with equal rights, associating to protect one another, etc. We therefore declare that, unable to endure the curse of monarchical government, we aim at founding a republic based on universal suffrage, which shall secure to all the intrinsic value of their labour. So this is classical republicanism, not just Irish republicanism, but we cannot have a monarchical government. We cannot have a king. We'll have a republic where everyone will have the vote based on universal suffrage. And then they can move on to the land question, and they say the soil of Ireland, at present in the possession of an oligarchy, belongs to us, the Irish people, and to us it must be restored. They talk about the separation of church and state. They say there must be absolute liberty of conscience and the separation of church and state. Now, I'm going to flag here a contradiction, which is common to all Irish Republican groups. They have already said in their proclamation, we have an alien aristocracy. Now, they say nothing about Protestants, they say nothing about planters or anything like that, but the implication is there. So the Protestant
They don't
ascendancy,
have
the
to.
Protestant upper class
Yeah.
is the enemy, you know? Now they also say we have absolute liberty of conscience and the complete separation of church and state, and they never say we're Catholics or anything like that, but the implication is still there. They also say we intend no war against the people of England. Our war is against the aristocratic locusts, they say. And they say, Republicans of the entire world, our cause is your cause, our enemy is your enemy. And you workmen of England, it is not only your hearts we wish, but your arms. But again, this is very idealistic stuff. It's almost like workers of the world unite, as Marx said in his Communist Manifesto. But again, there's a contradiction here. They want an Irish republic. They're appealing to Irish history. So this is something you still see in Irish republicanism, and you've probably always seen. There's a number of contradictions between the universalist ideas of Irish republicanism and to some extent the kind of not quite socialist in this case, but like social leveling ideas. There's a contradiction between them on the one hand and the Irish nationalism, which is a very strong part of it as well.
There are a lot of issues there that people who were opposed to the Fenians at the time can make hay with, particularly the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church is really rising power, social power in Ireland, and has been since the early 1800s when it's basically legalized, with the decline of the penal laws, as discussed in our previous podcast. But particularly the Bishop of Dublin, Cardinal Cullen, is absolutely against the Fenians. The Fenians are godless atheists. They're in league with these French Republicans, who were tried to destroy Brother Church. They're also a secret society, which the Catholic Church is very against. A bishop of Kerry, I believe it is, famously says that eternity is not long enough, nor hell is not hot enough for the Fenians, such bad people as they are. So the
Yes.
Catholic Church very much against them. Obviously, the aristocracy, who they refer to, the landowning class, the gentry, well, they're very afraid of them, and with good reason, actually. And the British, naturally, very afraid of them. But you also have, what's interesting is the Freeman's Journal, which was in earlier periods was a Connellite paper, also kind of critical of the Fenians. Like it says, like the Irish people have lots of grievances, but these guys are kind of lower class types and they're full of mad ideas and they don't know what they're doing and they'll just get us into trouble as well. So there's a certain amount of the Catholic middle class that kind of stands aloof as well.
Well, it's interesting drawing the parallel between this document and the 1916 proclamation. Like, in some ways, this is a lot more explicitly democratic. It's a lot more explicitly non-sectarian, and it's a lot more explicitly
Secular.
secular. It's a lot more explicitly, maybe it's the wrong word, but socialist.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's more mid 19th century Enlightenment revolutionary republicanism. You will find that stuff or similar stuff in the 1916 proclamation, but 1916 has maybe more romantic nationalism in it, perhaps.
Yes, and as you mentioned there with the Catholic Church, it's also the period of Garibaldi and the efforts to unite Italy. And there are a lot of Catholics that are starting to see the benefits. Not a lot, but like a certain class of Catholics are starting to see the benefits of the Union and emancipation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is like, we just talked about the famine and what a catastrophic episode that was. At the same time, I mean, the 19th century, a story in the 19th century in Ireland is that they are reforming the place. The British are, they have removed the restrictions on Catholics, and Catholics are becoming the middle class majority, actually. Like they could elect O'Connell as the Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841 because the propertied Catholics are the majority. Now they're not the very richest people, but there's enough of them with enough property. So it's wrong to think that the Catholic masses are all oppressed and they're all really poor. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, so we shouldn't see, you know, the opposition to Fenianism as purely the old ascendancy class or
No,
Protestants in general.
no, certainly not Protestants in general. And there's some very prominent Fenians who are Protestants, like Charles Luby in Dublin, the most prominent one. But I always wondered about this as a kid, actually, Cahill, because you learn that the Fenians were great people. They were Democrats and they were secularists and so on. And why would anybody take the word Fenian as an insult? Because these were great people. That's what I was taught as a kid. And I always wondered also, since the Fenians were secularists, which, the head of the organization were, how did it become a term of abuse for Catholics in the north of Ireland? And I mean, I think it's because, the Fenians are also associated on the ground with the agrarian tradition. And the agrarian tradition is sort of sectarian. Like people don't want to hear that maybe, but it is. Like, so I mean, if you look at the poems in Irish in the early 19th century from the Ribbon Men and the Rockouts and stuff like that, they do say, that we will get rid of the clan of Luther and we will reclaim the country for the true people, which is the Catholics. So the land question and the sectarian question are linked. We might not wish it wasn't so, but I mean, Irish history dictated that it would be so.
Well, it really is impossible to divide the two, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, they're different. I mean, like, so there's a sectarian question in urban areas as well, which is not the same. And so the stuff that in Dublin at the time, the politics are quite sectarian and they've nothing to do with the land question. And in Belfast, they're just getting going at the time,
Yeah.
where they will obviously be extremely sectarian. But in the land, you cannot escape the fact that the Protestant ascendancy, as we call it, is partly descended from the people who conquered the country in the 1500s and the 1600s, who confiscated the land from Catholics and who there, passed laws saying the Catholics could not own land in the 1700s. So the two things are linked. And so Fenian, I suspect, as an insult, comes from this idea that the Fenians are the rural underclass and that they are coming for your property and so on.
Now, your part of the world, South County Dublin, that is one
Mm-hmm.
of the areas where probably the most prominent encounter during the 1867 rebellion out in Tala. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. Now, let me back up just a little bit to talk about the plans for the rebellion, right? So, the plans for the rebellion are drafted basically because all the leaders are getting arrested. So, it's quite like 1848, but they import quite a lot of Civil War veterans from the United States. So, something we just spoke about, Carl. Now, the two leaders on the military side are going to be a man called Thomas Kelly, who was a Civil War veteran, who was made the Deputy Central Organizer of the Irish Republic. And the military planning is done by a guy who's termed General Millen. So I haven't been able to get his first name, but he is again a veteran of the Civil War. Now, the plan is
Well, we
for
should
it's
say
to
as
kind
well,
of do,
sorry, John,
yeah,
that these
yeah,
veterans are very easily identified when they come to Ireland because they're wearing
yeah.
US military issue boots and hats.
Yeah, and I mean, Padraig O'Rourke, who has been on the show a couple of times, told me an anecdote from Limerick City where the constabulary are put at the train station and they're told to arrest everybody wearing these kind of boots, and they're the US military boots from the Union Army, So, yeah, I mean, they're drafted in around the country, and the leaders draft a plan. It's a twofold plan, basically. One of them is for kind of outbreaks around the country, guerrilla warfare. And at the same time, there's going to be an insurrection in Dublin, which is the centre of power, where they hope that the soldiers, the Irish soldiers in the military garrison, will mutiny. So it's a twofold plan: a guerrilla warfare to kind of distract British attention, and then a mutiny at the centre of power to seize basically the centre of power in Dublin. Now, what happens is pretty uninspiring. So there's a load of Fenians, interestingly, like they're called men of the working class type. They reported they march out of Dublin towards what they call Tala Hill, which is now
Mm.
called Mount Seskin, and it's over Killinarden in the southwest of Dublin, but just over the modern suburb of Tala. This is supposed to be a decoy because, again, there's supposed to be an uprising triggered by a military mutiny in the city of Dublin. Now, the military mutiny, of course, never happens, but as many as maybe 5,000. So there's various reports, but from 4,000, 6,000, up to 8,000 are reported marching out to Tala Hill, to Mount Seskin. They come across parties of the constabulary on the way out, and there's a skirmish in Tala where three Fenians are killed. Some accounts actually online have the report that the constabulary barracks is attacked, but actually that's not the case. So what happens is the constabulary come out of the barracks in Tala and they open fire. They fire several volleys at Fenians who were heading towards the hill. So the Fenians were not supposed to get in contact with the constabulary in Tala. They were supposed to make their way to the hill, where, by the way, God knows what they were supposed to do. So you're like the Grand Old Duke of York marching people up the hill. And what were they supposed to do there? I'm not sure. A Japanese scholar has written an article about this, trying to explain, and we don't really know. Now, further east in the mountains, so closer, as you said, Cathal, to my part of the world, in Rathfarnham, there's a more successful action by a group of Fenians who are led again by an American Civil War veteran, and they capture a number of police barracks up in the mountains at Glencullen and Enniskerry and places like that. They successfully captured them, so it's almost like a War of Independence style action from 60 years later. But again, they're up in the mountains. They have moved out of the centre of power. There's supposed to be an uprising in Dublin, and nothing happens. So up in Tala, you have several thousand men armed up on the hill. It's a very cold night. This is March 1867. As you know, March can be one of the coldest months of the year in Ireland. So there's snow and there's sleet. And after, a night where the city hasn't stirred, they just come back and they drift back to the city and they abandon much of their arms. So quite a lot of arms they had assembled in the fields of the hills and the mountains there. There's also mobilizations in Drogheda. So apparently up to 1,000 men came out in Drogheda. There's an attack on a police barracks in Fair Hill in Cork City. There's quite a large mobilization there. There risings out, as they used to say, in Kerry and Limerick and stuff. But by the end of the day, 12 people are dead, of whom 8 are Fenians. Several hundred have been arrested, and that's it. So it's a terribly anticlimactic end to the rebellion.
Yes, and I suppose what's remembered even more so than the actual rebellions and skirmishes themselves is what happens in Manchester afterwards.
Yeah, this again shows the strength of the Fenian movement in England. So among the Irish working class immigrants especially in the north of England, the Fenian Brotherhood is very strong, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. As we mentioned before, there's like a massed attack on a depot in Chester, which is near Manchester. Well, it's not, it's near Wales, but it's not too far from Manchester. In Manchester itself, the two Fenian leaders, Kelly and DC, had been arrested, and one of the local circles was charged with rescuing them on the street in Manchester. And what they do is they go up and they stop the police van, which is escorting them to prison. They shoot open the lock, but they accidentally, as it happened, shot a warder in the eye and killed him. And the three men, famously named in subsequent songs, Alan, Larkin, and O'Brien, are hanged for murder. Now, the two leaders, actually, Kelly and DC, got away and were spirited, I think, to America, if I remember correctly. But the only executions that happened as a result of the 1867 rebellion were of these three men in Manchester who were hanged for murder. There's a great campaign in Ireland for by great, I mean, very large campaign for clemency and great collections for the widows and the dependents of the three men, Alan, Larkin, and O'Brien. And it's a surprisingly large resonance for the rest of the 19th century in Ireland. Like there's Manchester Martyrs demonstrations every year. It's an annual thing where all of Irish nationalism goes along to pay their respects to what to us appears to be a side effect almost of the rising of 1867, the failed uprising, and three men who hadn't meant to kill anyone at all,
Well,
and who
again,
were
we can
hanged.
sort of see a forerunner to 1916. Like, not that many people are involved, but appeals for amnesty and release attract huge support among all sections of Irish society.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of the differences with 1916 because actually more people are involved in 1867. Like in Dublin, a minimum of 4,000 people come out in rebellion. Not very successfully, but they come out, and then there's several thousand around the country. So there's quite a lot of people involved in armed rebellion. It's just that it's a total failure. And unlike 1916, there isn't a very clear plan. There isn't serious fighting. But yeah, like you said, I think something appeals to the psyche of Irish nationalism about appeals for clemency and, well, they didn't deserve to be hanged. They went to the scaffold for Ireland. And this is the appeal of the Manchester martyrs. It does have something to do with the Catholic tradition of religious martyrs.
Hmm.
So, a religious martyr states their beliefs on the scaffold and then they witness the truth. And that's where they're killed. And so this is appropriated by Irish nationalism, really, this idea.
They do have a very solid case that murder implies premeditation, whereas this was purely shooting off a lock. Like you could say manslaughter. They did kill somebody, but it wasn't intentional. The other thing as well that's so famous about the trials of the Manchester martyrs, where they shout out one after the other, God save Ireland. And that becomes the line of a famous song, a famous nationalist anthem that really resonates for decades afterwards.
This is the core of what being a martyr is, though. A martyr means witness, They witness the truth. God save Ireland. We don't regret a thing. And this is what being a martyr is all about.
Yes, very much. And they're the three people we remember most from 1867.
Exactly. Like who remembers General Millen, who apparently planned the whole thing? One of the interesting things, this is just a side story, but I mean, I happened to come across this some years ago. A couple of Irish brothers who happened to be in Manchester, and like much later events in England, they're basically fitted up for the shooting of the prison guard. All these witnesses were lined up who it turns out had been coached. And now in their case, they're very lucky to get off because of course they would have been hanged. But it does show there's again parallels with events a century plus on in England where the police were under great pressure because the Fenians are seen to have challenged authority in an unacceptable way, that they're a danger to the public peace and an example must be made of them. So, the three who got hanged, I think they were involved, but I mean if they hadn't got them, they would have got others because they needed to make a show.
One of the defendants in the trial, his point was that when he was brought to a witness lineup along with other people for a witness to view, he was the only one that had manacles on on his hands, like on his wrists.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's a slightly later Fenian period, but Scotland Yard, so the special branch of the Metropolitan Police, was set up in response to Fenian activity. So it shows what a formative influence it was on British history as well.
Well, yes, and that's where we get the Royal Irish Constabulary from. They get their royal
Precisely.
appellation from post 1867.
Precisely. So one of the interesting things, just to comment on that, Cathal, I mean, whereas the Irish units of the army were deemed very unreliable and many of them were disarmed during the rebellion, the constabulary did their duty admirably and without hesitation. And many of whom were Catholics, including the officers. one of the things you see actually in the 1860s is that there's more Catholic officers than there is 60 years later,
Yes.
interestingly, in the constabulary. Like Mallon, who's the head of the special branch of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, for example, is a Catholic from South Armagh. He's an area associated with various kinds of rebellion. Anyway, the constabulary didn't falter, as it were, in 1867 in putting down the rebellion. And for this, they got their name, Royal Irish Constabulary. Now, just one more thing, though, again, and just tying in something I said earlier, the suspension of habeas corpus, though, so the suspension of normal peacetime legislation, which is the right not to be arrested without trial, goes on till 1869. And this is again because the Fenian Rebellion is not just about the failed attempt to take Dublin in 1867. It's about a kind of an agrarian rebellion around the
Mm.
country. And this might be where it has its long-term significance in some ways, because the next Liberal Prime Minister, Gladstone, takes from the Fenian period, like rather than just the day of rebellion in March 67, that something must be done to pacify Ireland. So Gladstone is going to go on and going to do a whole load of reforms, including disestablishing the Church of Ireland and the First Land Acts and so on. And of course, eventually Home Rule, they're going to attempt to pass Home Rule. But the Fenian period is not just the day of failed rebellion. It's a prolonged period of kind of agrarian insurgency.
Well, I think there is a lot more we could deal with in regards to the Fenians and the IRB, but that will have to be continued into a part two because I think we've
Yes,
only
indeed.
told half the story so far, John.
Yes, indeed. But I mean, if I may, I'm going to have a quote from the Irish Times, which at the time is a fiercely unionist newspaper. The Irish Times said at the time, after the failed rebellion of 1867, the Irish Times gloated that the rebels who have inflicted the greatest amount of trouble on the government, loyal people, and filled with alarm the isolated houses of the gentry, have shown themselves excellent at everything except actual rebellion.
Oh, they'd learn in future, wouldn't they? There was
Well, I
more to
mean,
come.
there was more to come now. We're going to get on to later periods of Fenian history. And the Fenians, in some ways, are important not so much for the failed rebellion as for the social movement that they represented and how that built the political parties and movements of Ireland of the late 19th century. But when there is a much more serious, in terms of the military aspect, insurrection in 1916, they are very influenced by the failures of 1867, aren't they?
Yes, yes. And they become a really important part of the mythology of Irish republicanism. And you have to place them in, the wider story of Irish nationalism. And they fit into that canon. As much as we say it's strange that 1848 is put in there, all of these events are included in a wider canon of Irish republicanism. That while it may have been a military failure, it does, there's small instances here and there around the country that provide songs, that provide inspiration, that inspire the next level. And as Patrick Pearse said, like, if our deeds do not win freedom, they will become an inspiration to the next leadership and the
Yeah,
next revolutionaries.
if we don't gain freedom, our children will gain it by a better deed.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
but I mean, in terms of the 1916 generation, so what they take from it is now, first of all, the plans must be kept secret, like not like 1867. Then you must have real secrecy, like the rank and file can't know what the plans are. There must not be informers. You must have very closed circles of information. And this is also true in a much bloodier way in the War of Independence as well. And Michael Collins obviously goes to great trouble to wipe out informers at that time. Even this has a precursor in 1867 because at the end of the year, the Fenians set up a thing called the shooting circle to shoot informers. And there's a number of informers killed in Dublin, a couple of policemen killed actually in Dublin as well. The mythos of the failed rebellion and why it failed and informers and infiltration and lack of secrecy is something that Irish Republicans carry with them into 1916 and that whole period.
So thank you very much, John. And you can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And please, if you get a chance, rate and review the show on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help. Like you hear it said at every podcast, but it does help. And if you want to leave a comment, we love to receive feedback from the audience. And we read them all, and it really does mean an awful lot to us. So thank you to everyone who's commented already. And we are very, very grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners, whenever you share an episode, whenever you tell your friends about one, or you write about it. That's really fantastic for us. And John has the Patreon as well for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story. And if you would consider supporting the show, that would be fantastic. And thank you very much to everyone who has supported it already. And there'll be a link in the show notes if you'd like to go to our Patreon. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-host, John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.